So welcome back to the second lecture in our series on the progressives. If you remember, the first lecture on progressives got cut off at the end. I was talking about the president that you see pictured here, President Theodore Roosevelt, the first modern president and the first progressive president. He would be followed by two more presidents, Taft, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, in short order, and together those three presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, make up the three progressive presidents to start off the 20th century. So really from, again, the time period we're looking at, 1900 to 1920, is the great moment of the progressive movement, and many of the reforms and accomplishments were achieved in that time period. I believe the last time, and just to sort of rehash and review, the idea that President Roosevelt brought to the table was that the government should intervene, should become active or activated, and use its powers to curb the worst excesses of free market capitalism, something that we studied a great deal in the Gilded Age. And we saw that while it did produce a great deal of prosperity and wealth in the United States, the wealth and prosperity was not widely and equally distributed, and that there were large pockets of poverty, people living in cities, in industrial cities in particular, living in slum conditions where there was a lot of filth and disease and ignorance and not a lot of advancement, not a lot of the idea of the American dream of making one's way up the social and economic ladder. So the idea of the progressive movement, and really captured, I think, by President Roosevelt, was to use the power of government, urged on by a series of middle-class writers that I think I mentioned in the video lecture number 1, who began to, in magazines, in newspapers, and in novels, begin to show the American public just what was really going on, what life was really like. And that's going to lead to a series of reforms. And again, I think I tried to stress the idea that the progressives are more concerned about action. Yes, the pen is important. Writing about ideas and studying situations is important, but really then one needed to do something about it, and that's where the progressive presidents come into play. So we're going to take a look at one of the things that Roosevelt started to do was attack the large trusts. And his first foray against a large trust was against the Northern Securities Railroad Trust, and it was a large trust that dominated rail traffic throughout much of the United States. And Roosevelt asked his Attorney General to file suit in court, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that, in fact, the Northern Securities Trust had to be broken up because it violated the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. So there had been a law all the way back to 1890 prohibiting the large trusts, but it had never really been applied or enforced. And again, one needs to remember that the job of the president is to enforce laws. So we might think of the presidents prior to Roosevelt, McKinley and Grover Cleveland, as having not done their jobs very well, or if at all, allowing the appearance of some 300 large trusts. And Roosevelt was going to begin the process of dismantling trusts. His successor, William Howard Taft, would follow up and actually file more suits against more trusts. So Roosevelt starts the era of trust busting, to bring these large corporations under some control, some government control, bring them to heel, and curb the excesses of power and wealth accumulation. I think I might have mentioned the 1902 coal strike. Coal miners had gone on strike, asking for higher wages and shorter work hours and safety precautions in the mines. Roosevelt directly intervened by convening a meeting of both sides, the mine owners and the mine workers, in Washington, something highly unusual. As you might remember, most presidents throughout the Gilded Age simply did not take action to support strikes, to support workers. They always called out the state militias or the federal army to suppress and break up strikes. And here's Roosevelt convening a meeting and personally mediating between both sides. And he was successful in getting a settlement done that didn't please the mine owners and didn't please the mine workers either, but nonetheless, he averted a prolonged strike that would have denied people coal at the time, which was used. The settling of the coal strike is, again, an example of a president that is progressive. Action over words. President Roosevelt then turned his attention to the meatpacking industries in Chicago. And this was really prompted by Upton Sinclair and his investigations, and then his novel, The Jungle, which we'll read part of. And so what happened was there was a Pure Food and Drug Act passed in 1905, 1906, whereby the government hired regulators and inspectors to go into meat packing plants and inspect for safety, for cleanliness, for hygiene, so that the food being produced, packaged, and sold was, again, safe for the American public, something that had not always been the case. Roosevelt also got Congress to pass what was known as the Hepburn Act in 1906, and that was to regulate the actions of the railroads that, again, were still raking in lots of money by charging unfair, uncompetitive prices to the public. So again, the government is going to try to provide some relief to the people to help them live a better life. And Roosevelt, I think, his beliefs and actions are really captured by this famous quote. And he said, and I quote, "The great corporations or trusts are the creatures of the state, and the state not only had the right to control them, but it is duty bound to control them wherever the need of such control is shown," end quote. Now that may sound like a confusing jumble of words, but what Roosevelt's saying is the corporations are actually created, legally constituted by states that grant corporations the right to conduct business within a state or across state lines. And so Roosevelt's saying that the government actually creates the states, therefore the government has a right to regulate and oversee their actions. And that's really necessary when trusts act and behave badly. So Roosevelt kind of creates this distinction between, well, there are good trusts that do good things for the public, and there are bad trusts. And he was more interested in attacking the bad trusts.
Okay, so I think that we can conclude that Roosevelt was a fairly active, energetic president who took his role seriously in trying to defend the interests of the people of the United States and create more level and fair conditions, both for companies and for consumers. Something, again, reminding you the square deal. All right, we're going to briefly touch on William Howard Taft, Roosevelt's successor. So Roosevelt took over in 1901 for the assassinated William McKinley. He was reelected in 1904, broadly with lots of support. In 1908, Roosevelt could have run for the presidency again, but declined, and he passed the torch to his handpicked successor, William Howard Taft, who runs for the Republican Party and wins in that race against William Jennings Bryan again. And William Howard Taft then launches a series of moves to against the trusts, and that would be his primary legacy. He's going to be much more aggressive in trying to tame the trusts than Roosevelt ever was. And one other signature accomplishment under Taft's 4-year presidency was the Elkins Act, which limited again the actions of the large railroads, trying to again promote fairness and more competition, which would be better for the American public. So we're not going to go into much more detail with William Howard Taft, a rather large, rotund president, a 300-pound president, some interesting stories about Taft. But at any rate, we're going to go on and look at the presidential election of 1912, which became a 4-candidate race in the United States. And interesting in U.S. presidential history, you had Theodore Roosevelt decided that he actually missed the presidency, missed the White House, wanted to jump back in the race. But the Republican Party would not have him. So he formed his own independent third party called the Progressive Party and adopted a moose as its symbol. Roosevelt was quite a hunter, like the moose, thought the moose was a cool animal, and so Roosevelt creates what's called the Bull Moose Party. William Howard Taft ran for the Republicans, so he's the incumbent president. For the Democrats, a man named Woodrow Wilson appears on the scene, and he had been the governor of New Jersey, had been a very progressive governor in the state of New Jersey. Woodrow Wilson also happened to teach political science at Bryn Mawr College, right down the street from Radnor High School. And then there would be Eugene Debs, a socialist. Kind of interesting. So, and Debs did very well in the race, though, of course, did not win. So the central issue in the election of 1912 was the Truss System And what the American public eventually did was they chose Wilson by default. Not that they overwhelmingly supported Wilson, but Roosevelt and Taft divided the Republican vote in two, which left Wilson to kind of crawl across the finish line in that presidential election of 1912. And Wilson then assumed the presidency, and he had his program that was progressive as well, known as New Freedom, and he wanted to restore freedom to the United States. So not only the people, but freedom. And he pushed for something called the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914. Wilson also created or pushed for the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. So now we have a national currency created and regulated by the United States government, something that we had been talking about when we looked into the history of money. Wilson also had the creation of a federal income tax, again in 1913, to raise revenue for the government. Under Wilson, we also see the direct election of senators for the first time. No longer will they be appointed by state legislatures. We also see the vote for women under Wilson's presidency, and we also see prohibition. So during Wilson's two-term tenure, 8 years in office, there are a number of rather important reforms. Wilson also would try to regulate merchant marine activities and child labor and other things that are quite important. So Wilson deserves a lot of attention, and we will look into him more closely. So with that being said, we're going to wrap up our look into U.S. presidents, leaving Wilson as the last progressive president. We'll also look at Wilson when we look into World War I in the very near future. So I want to end this video lecture with a man named Herbert Crawley, who published a book called The Promise of American Life in 1910. And Herbert Crawley attacked the idea of free market, laissez-faire capitalism, and he attacked it because he argued that it destroyed the American dream. And what Herbert Crawley is going to argue in this book is that strong state action is needed to sort of right the wrongs of an industrial capitalist society that had kind of run wild. And that's something that's going to be very influential. And you can see that with the progressive presidents, Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson, I think that they were kind of influenced in part by Crawley. I mean, Wilson becomes president in 1913, so Crawley had probably a more direct influence on Wilson than Roosevelt. But the idea is there's something in the air, and the idea is that the American government had to step in to regulate the economic life of the big corporations to hold out the promise, again, of the American life and the American dream. So it's something that's kind of interesting. And we're going to see different writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald in the 1920s writing The Great Gatsby, which in many ways I think deals with the American dream, different aspects of it through a fictional lens. However, the characters and situations that Gatsby creates do directly relate to the American dream. So it seems that there's a lot of attention being focused on the American dream and the American way of life, in fact. So we're going to end this lecture on progressivism with that. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.